Okay, well, good evening. Today is May 12th, 2020. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I'm Phil Santonzi, Program Chair for ASQ Section 1510, Southeast Florida. Welcome to our monthly presentation. This is our third coronavirus-induced virtual meeting. And as you heard me say just a couple of minutes ago, I thought they've been going pretty well. Still getting used to this environment, but I think it'll be productive for you tonight, and it has been productive in the past. You can check out ASQ Section 1510 on our in the Communities tab of the myasq.org website, and you can join our LinkedIn group, which is ASQ Southeast Florida Section 1510. So there's a number of ways that you can keep tabs on what's happening in the section. As I mentioned earlier, during the presentation, please keep your audio muted until we open up for questions at the end, and I'll explain that process a little bit later. This event is being recorded, and as I say, it will be uploaded to the ASQ 1510 YouTube channel afterwards. The PDF version of the slides will also be posted to our LinkedIn group, so you can access either or both of those later on. I wouldn't check before tomorrow, however. So today's presentation is food processing compliance. I would now get to our speaker and the presentation. This presentation overviews food safety management programs that are approved, benchmarked global food safety initiate schemes. That's the GFSI, if you're not familiar with that acronym. Several standards will be discussed, with a focused interest on the FSSC 22000, which includes 2 ISO standards in that package. You will also hear a brief overview of the role of the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Food and Drug Administration, including some recent legislation. The food industry is very complex, I'm sure, as you all realize and know, and it does cut across many sectors, and requirements will vary depending on the product sector, as does the risk. Our speaker is Debby Newslow. Debby is the president of DL Newslow and Associates, which is celebrating 23 years in business this year. She's a member of several food safety and quality organizations and is currently an active member of the Food Safety Tech Advisory Board. She's a frequent author of published articles and 2 textbooks related to food safety and quality management systems, including the latest book, which is Food Safety Management Programs, Applications, Best Practices, and Compliance. It's a bestseller in the world of food safety and the GFSI compliance guidance. Debby has several years of combined industry, third-party auditing, consulting, and training experience, focusing on quality management systems, including ISO, and food safety programs at GFSI. She has won numerous awards, including in 2013, the National Science Foundation Food Safety Leadership Award for training. She's a Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance lead instructor. That's the FSPCA, for those of you who are wondering. And also the International Alliance, the IHA HACCP, as an instructor. And she's an IRCA, Certified Quality and Food Safety Lead Assessor. As a member of ASQ since 1988, Debby has earned several of our certifications. A native Bostonian, spending much of her youth on Cape Cod, she left the Northeast to become a Gator, go Gators, at the University of Florida, graduating from there with a food science degree. Along with her love for animals, the Red Sox and the ocean remain her passions. So join me, please, in welcoming Debby. Debby, go ahead and take it away, please.
Thank you, Phil. Can you see my screen?
We see it.
Okay, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to do this. Phil contacted me and said, we want to talk about what's going on in food processing with not only the standards that relate to it, but some of the laws. And hey, the laws have really evolved over the years. So I'm going to go through this. There's not a lot of slides, so please share your questions and may elaborate on some of them later on at the end. So if I go too fast, I guess you can also let me know that too. I'll try to slow down. That's the one
Will
of the
will
many things that,
do.
yeah,
Will
one of
do.
the things I keep from, and it seems like it's coming back worse since we've been doing this at home shut-in business. And I'm getting my Boston accent and my New England, trying to rush through things. So I'll try to discipline on that. But anyways, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to get going. So, see, can I get rid of the window that's here, Phil?
Which window? The participants?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a little arrow to the left of the word participants, you click on that and click close. See the little arrow to the left of the word participants?
Yeah, but I don't see anything about close.
Okay, well, you can at the top, if you just grab it and just slide it to the right a little bit, that might work. Okay, no, that won't work. I guess you're stuck with it.
There you go. I'll put you on here. Okay. So anyways, so regulatory versus voluntary requirements. Basically, for a long time, we've basically, the food industry has really kind of been on its own. There hasn't been a lot of regulations. Well, there've been regulations, but how have they really been really been enforced? In the food companies, depending on what your sector is and what you're doing, it just depends. You have to each company has to really determine what regulatory environment and what they have to follow as far as regulations. In the U.S., there are local, there's state, and there's federal oversight to food processing. In federal, we have FDA and USDA monitoring actions and going into plants and doing audits, but we also have the state regulations and also the county going in. So local and state rules will vary. We're going to focus on the federal oversight right now, and it's really, in a lot of cases, depending on what the subject and the risk of the manufacturing, really up to the state as to whether they accept the federal regulations. United States Department of Agriculture, or USDA, they regulate the meat and poultry, and then FDA regulates about 80% of everything else. So really, the FDA monitors the food manufacturing for the most part, but then USDA has their own focus. Like, for instance, meat and poultry, certain eggs, depends on the eggs, not shelled eggs. Shelled eggs are by FDA, so it can be quite complex. So this will tell you a little bit about the comparing and the contrast. So FDA inspects every registered facility at a frequency based on risk. So manufacturers that fall under FDA must be registered, and they get a registration. They have to renew it every couple years, and FDA will follow them and see, well, what are the high risk? The high risk ones they will go into more frequently, and lower risk. And we can talk about what the difference is. Many of the low risk facilities only see FDA, maybe every 5 years, unless something happens, unless they have a complaint or a serious recall. Now, the FDA regulations can all be found under Title 21. We recently kind of recently, 2015, the Food Safety Modernization Act was released. It has 7 parts to it, and we'll talk about those, and I'll explain those in detail on a later slide. But 21 CFR is really where the FDA regulations are for food manufacturing. There are some products such as bottled water, seafood, 100% juice. They have their own special laws. And those were developed back in the late 90s, early 2000, where they started seeing because of the recalls, because of things going on in the industry sector, FDA put together a special regulation for it. Now they monitor 100% juice and seafood. Those will follow under FDA requirements. Up until 2015, those were really the only industries that were required by law to have a food safety program, by law. But most customers in today's world now are focusing on their clients and their suppliers, and requiring them to have a structured food safety program. And we'll get into that. That's in a few minutes. That's above and beyond anything that the law or regulation says they have to have. Now, as we said earlier, FDA accounts for about 80% of food manufacturing and what goes on in the food industry. USDA picks up the rest. And so a lot of companies, like for instance, it can be very confusing, because if you're in Florida and you manufacture juice, you're required to have a USDA representative on site whenever you're manufacturing that juice. However, the juice itself is governed by FDA. So like I said, it's going to be very confusing. And sometimes, depending on the interpretation, depending on the inspector you get there's a lot of confusion from that. So the agency has a mandate to inspect at least 5% of product that is produced or imported for consumption in the U.S. And all USDA regulations are under Title IX, so it would be 9 CFR and then whatever the extension is for it. Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Federal Poultry Inspection date back to the early 1900s. That's one of the first, 1906, in Teddy Roosevelt regime, was when one of the first food safety regulations was released, and that was the Federal Meat Inspection Act. And they also had something called the Pure Food and Drug Act. Now that was 1906. It wasn't very intense, but it was a law, and it was something that they were trying to enforce. Now the Food Safety Modernization Act, which is right there, also known as FSMA, that was released back in, it started to be released. It was actually signed into law in 2011 by Obama, but it was very, very involved. And actually, the first part of it, there's 7 parts. The first part really didn't go into effect until September 2015. A lot of back and forth analysis of it, trying to figure out how to approach it, trying to figure out how to make it work. And actually, there was a lot of guesswork as to what that was going to involve. Finally, there was some kind of class action or a suit against the government saying, we can't go on just wondering what it's going to be. We have to have a date. And that's when September 2015 became the first part that was released. And that was a section called Preventive Controls Qualified Individual, PCQI, for human food. And that was released. And then they also had, which include current manufacturing practices, hazard analysis, preventive controls for human food. That was released in September of 2015, as was the current manufacturing practices, hazard analysis, and preventive controls for animals. This is 21 CFR 117, and this is 21 CFR 509. So these were released. Certain companies had 1 year, depending on the risk and the size of the facility, to be compliant. And then depending on the size and the risk of the product, it was up to 3 years before it would go into effect. So the FDA regulations and the FSMA Act, Food Safety Modernization Act, really was the first overhaul since 1938. I told you a little bit about what happened in 1906. In the 1920s, there was a little bit more done. There were a lot of issues with raw milk in the 1920s, and that kind of came around with the pasteurized milk ordinance, where all milk had to be pasteurized. Different things happened through the 20s and 30s, and then in 1938, the government rescinded the first act that they had done in 1906, and released the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act, and that was 1938. And the next major change that was around for the 40s and 50s, there was some additions to it in the 60s and 70s when there started to be some foodborne illnesses coming out. They had a regulation for canning and hot packed product. Several people in the early 70s got sick from botulism in Vichyssoise soup. And that kind of stopped all canning until they could release the canning regulations. And that was in the 70s. But here we are in 2015, and that's when really, oops, I didn't mean to do that, sorry. That's when really an overhaul came to that, and that was the Food Safety Modernization Act. And you see it as 2011, and that's when it was signed in law, but it really didn't start going into effect, the first two parts of it, until 2015, and then everybody had a year to handle it. It applies to manufacturers, processors, packers, and holders of food intended for consumption in the United States. So what that is saying is anybody that manufactures a product, no matter how large you are, that you must have a food safety program, and you must evaluate your process for your hazards and have that written and be in compliance with the Food Safety Modernization Act. The other issues that came up, the next things that were released was a foreign supplier verification program. That has to do with importing. And it says there's certain requirements on the manufacturing of product that's imported to be used in food in the United States, where the foreign bodies have to comply with these requirements. They have to have the written evidence, the records of it, to show that they meet the U.S. requirements. And it's quite involved. It's a lot more than just importing. It's having an FSVP importer that has the records and has confirmed that this product that is coming into the country has been manufactured to meet the requirements of the Food Safety Modernization Act. And then we have standards for produce safety. Over the recent past, there has been several major outbreaks with produce and safety. So this is a very comprehensive standard. It focuses really only on the micro part of it, on the pathogens that come with product safety. If you do produce, you have to comply with this portion of the Food Safety Modernization Act as far as controlling your pathogens, the bacteria that make you sick. All your other things like possible chemical hazards or physical hazards fall under this current manufacturing for human food. So it's quite complex when you try to explain it. After a while, you get to understand it, but it's a challenge for sure. Now, when we talk about, I'm sorry guys, I'm not confident on this. I'm not using my printer, on my mouse. So really, these are four of the major. The minor ones have to do with intentional adulteration. That means that somebody is intentionally adulterating a product for monetary gain. We've had several instances of that in the past years. You may all be familiar with the melamine issues out of China, where they had using melamine to raise the nitric acid in the product. Nitric acid is a measure of the protein level, so they would make more money. Well, melamine is a chemical that is very poisonous, and this went in animal food and baby food imported from China. So that was a very serious outbreak. Another example that happened a couple of years ago, manufacturers of the spice cumin, they decided they thought that they could add another crushed material to it so that they could increase the yield and make more money. But they weren't very bright, because they actually crushed peanut shells and added the peanut shells to the cumin so that they would have a larger yield. And they were caught because some people had some terrible allergens to peanuts. And where are the peanuts? No one could find them, and they found them in the cumin. So those guys went to jail. So, so that's the intentional adulteration. There's also one on transportation of human food and animal food. There's a lot of work on the transport in the trucks. There's never really been any program up to require that these trucks are cleaned or in any kind of sanitary condition from one product to the next. So that rule went into effect. So that, as you can see, they're pretty busy with issuing these rules right now. And pretty much they're all in effect now. They had, each one came out at some point over the last 5 years and had a certain grace period to be compliant with it. So that's really the regulations. We'll talk maybe a little bit about that later too, but now we'll get into the voluntary part, the voluntary standards. So today's industry chooses to adhere to voluntary standards. You know, it's what happened in 2000, a little bit later, the late 1990s and 2000, is that the large chains, and you know, they wanted to be they wanted to be assured that there was that the product they were buying was safe. And you know, the ISO 9001 standard, you know, it started back in 1987, and when it came over to the US, I think the first US certification was 1994. But you know, the food industry was pretty hesitant because they thought ISO was synonymous with having a lot of documentation. So they kind of really turned their nose up to ISO 9001. Well, what happened was when the large customers like Walmart and Costco and Kroger and Publix and them, they wanted their sources to have some kind of documentation to prove that they're manufacturing under some kind of structure and discipline, such as an ISO standard. That's when the Global Food Safety Initiative got going. So like here, you know, first thing is that, you know, customers, you know, people like Publix or Walmart wrote to their suppliers based on risk and said, you have this amount of time to have a food safety standard implemented and be approved to it. Same structure as 9001, more or less, but there are other standards. So if you come up over here, accreditation, these are what we call the Global Food Safety Initiative. What GFSI stands for is Global Food Safety Initiative. And it was put together by a group of manufacturers, and they came up with guidelines. You cannot be certified to GFSI, but what GFSI does is it benchmarks. It has a set of requirements. And if you have a food safety standard, you submit it to the board on the GFSI board, and they evaluate it and they approve it. They benchmark, approve it to confirm that it meets their guidelines. Then, so a company can say, okay, they'll send a letter out. I want you to be certified by December 31st, 2020 to a GFSI approved benchmark in the scheme or CPO, certified disciplines. So that's what was going on. And it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. So we have the most recent, the standards have been around. You may have heard of some of them, some of you that have done some work or just have been reading some of the things that are out there on it. These are examples of some of the benchmarked standards. You know, my background is ISO 9001. So, you know, I worked with companies in getting in the early days, in the late 80s, 1980s and early 1900s, and getting certified in 9001. And, you know, and then I was an auditor for over 20 years, auditing to 9001. So, you know, I can see the benefit of 9001, but, you know, the ISO structure is part of FSSC 22000. But these are other benchmarks, and there's some others too. Safe Quality Food, this Safe Quality Food Institute, the BRC, British Royal Consortium, Global Standards. That's British International Featured Standards, IFS, that's a German standard. These are more general. The ones in the US that you really see, generally speaking, in the food industry are these three. Primus is, some of these others are specific. Primus specific, very specific for produce. Canada, this is a produce, this is produce, this is seafood, and there's others that really focus, a couple of them focus on meat. But these are more general. They have different sectors in them, and they identify. So if you're a beverage, you might be section 3, or you know, section 3 and 11. If you're pet food, would probably be section 4 and whatever. So That's how these are broken up. Sometimes it's very confusing. Our BRC and SQF, they're okay. The standards are they're good standards. They're evolving, but they're very prescriptive. BRC in its last release, it's pretty prescriptive. SQF has been prescriptive over the years. It's trying not to be quite that way. You know, it's kind of like a checklist standard. In the early days, it's kind of like if you have a corner, if the standard says you need a sink in that corner, you need a sink in that corner. It doesn't matter about risk or that you really need a sink for the process. Where FSSC, in the interest of ISO, it integrates like ISO does and integrates into it. FSS, and it's kind of an interesting story because back in when ISO 22000 was released, 2005, it was submitted to the GFSI board and to be benchmarked. Well, it failed. It failed because although it mentioned prerequisite programs, the prerequisite programs are those programs that you have in place to support your food safety program, kind of like GMPs, pest control, things like that. It mentioned that you had to have them and had to be effective, but it didn't really give you the minimum standard, the minimum requirements that you needed to really have an effective program. So it kind of sent the people back to the drawing boards, and they came back in 2009 with another standard, and it was called, at that time it was called PAS 220. Now it is called ISO 22002-1. And that takes all the individual prerequisite programs that are required by the GFSI guidelines and goes into a lot more detail as to what's required. So they submitted ISO 22000 and ISO 22002-1 to the Global Food Safety Initiative board. And together they said, okay, that can be one of our approved benchmark standards. Thus, FSSC was born, and that includes those two standards. Now, a company can still get certified to ISO 22000. It just doesn't meet by itself the requirements of this GFSI guideline. So that's kind of a lot to take in, but it's a lot to say too. It can sound kind of convoluted. But so a company that wants to be certified, they get a letter from Publix and says you have to be certified, by this date to a GFSI approved scheme or CPO. They can pick whatever they want that fits them. If they're seafood, they really should pick something that's seafood for them, or if they're produce, something that relates to produce. But they also could do one of these, and you can pick it. Now we work with basically all three of these. We do some others, but with the produce industry. And it just really depends on the operation. And they're managed a little bit like ISO, these guys are. And this one is a lot like ISO because it's made up of ISO. So I picked FSSC 22000 because I figured that most of you all were pretty much used to the ISO standards. Later on, if you have questions about the others, we can discuss them. But FSSC 22000 is ISO-based system. ISO 22000 was just released. It was released in 2005, and the next version was released in 2018, and it is the same design, the same of ISO 9001 2015, of the ISO 14000 and 45001. So ISO 22000 is designed in the same format, same sections. A lot of it really is the same. I mean, a lot of the things, like if you read about management review, it's pretty much all the same requirements. In some cases where you'd see something about quality in 9001, you're going to see wording about food safety in 22000. So and that was so that companies can integrate. We have a lot of companies that are certified to all four, and some of them are struggling because it's pretty much very similar, all four of them, but they have them defined differently, and it really complicates things when they're being audited. It costs a lot more too. You can get audited to an integrated system, and you have one or two auditors, but when they come on board, they're looking at management review, And they're looking at how it applies to the food safety, to the quality, to the environmental and the safety. And it's a much more, it's much more organized and streamlined. So as you know, ISO is an international organization that develops and publishes standards for many different industries. The FSSC certification requires the compliance to the ISO standards, and it's based on the nature of your business. Over the years, since ISO 22002-1 for basic manufacturing was developed to go with ISO 22000 to become FSSC, since then they have other sister documents that they have developed. So if you're manufacturing packaging has a lot less, it's not as strict, some of the requirements, obviously, because it's not food product. You're not going to eat it. The package is going to handle it. You still have to meet basic requirements. So they came up with another sister document, ISO 22002-4. So if you're in packaging, you would have 22000 and ISO 22002-4. I'm gonna mess up soon these numbers, it sounds complicated. But if you're a company that is working towards this or interested in this, or if you're interested in it because you want your suppliers to do it, we're doing a lot of work now. I have a company that's doing secondary packaging. Secondary packaging is packaging that it goes on a food product, but it doesn't touch the product. And they're getting a lot of push right now to become certified to FSSC 22000, because it's critical to the structure and discipline is, you can't beat it. And if it's done effectively. The other standards, if they can be done effectively and you can have a good job with it, but to me, the ISO, you integrate the requirements into it, and it's ongoing, where you're continually with internal auditing, continuous improvement, management responsibility. And it really does add value to your operation if it's done properly. I'm not really putting down the other standards. Like I said, my whole background is with ISO, and I've spent the last 30 years really seeing the advantage of integrating the requirements in a way that adds value to an operation. So it's important. Now, some of this I've already said. So food manufacturers and processes, if you're a food manufacturer or processes and you wish to obtain 22000, you must demonstrate compliance to the following standards. This is what I was just telling you about. Also, there's also a third thing where FSSC has its own website, and they also they have some other requirements. They really take the requirements of the ISO standards and just kind of elaborate on them in here. It's only about 2 pages long of what's required. But this is if you're a manufacturer of a food product that you consume. If it was a packaging item, then this would be 22002-4. Hazard analysis critical control point systems are required by the GFSI benchmark programs. HACCP stands for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. We abbreviate it into this. It's pronounced HACCP. It means that all FSSC 22000 certified facilities must have a HACCP plan. That's a plan where you identify your product, you identify your process steps, your ingredients, your materials, and you do a hazard analysis based on the risk. And you could come up with a point in the process where if you don't control it, then you either going to result in a very significant hazard where people are going to get very sick or die, or you increase the likelihood of that happening. And that's kind of how you put it together. HACCP is required for meat and poultry plants. That's the law under USDA. You mentioned that earlier. FDA requires HACCP for 100% juice and seafood. That's the law. That was since the seafood was like 1998 and juice was 2001. So companies that produce 100% juice must be compliant to that regulation. And now under the new FSMA rule, Food Safety Modernization Act, they have made it required that all processing, anybody that processes food must have a food safety program, like in the design of HACCP, where you identify the risks and you show that you have processes in place to control or eliminate. Control means you keep it to an acceptable level, or you eliminate it altogether or keep it out. So, and it's a combination of all of this. So the bottom line really is, if you're new to the food industry, make sure you get training before you begin construction or development of the business plan. It's very important. We see some very, very strange things when we go out there. I had one client that was manufacturing gluten-free bakery product, and he actually had a mixer in there that looked a lot like a food grade mixer, but it really wasn't, because it was actually a mixer that he bought at Home Depot. So, I mean, there are certain requirements that have to be met, and they're not the easiest things to translate into the world. And of course, it's all about money too. So we like to make sure that people really look for a business plan, get some help, and evaluating what's really necessary. Because this is true. Sadly, we've seen people who wasted a lot of money building something that had to be overhauled in order to meet the requirements for food safety. The federal and voluntary requirements, they really have responsibilities at state and local levels. The government, the regulation, FDA does not really acknowledge companies that have a food safety program compliant with GFSI. However, you can have, and you integrate the regulation into that. It's just that some companies say, well, I have this GFSI approved scheme, so I'm okay. I don't have to do what the FDA says or USDA says I have to, and that's not true. You need a detailed understanding of the regulatory environment necessary before beginning production, and the responsibility for food safety rests with the industry, not necessarily the government. And it means there is a liability. A company is responsible, absolutely responsible, to produce a safe product that is free of a hazard. And being ignorant is not an excuse. I can tell you so many lawsuits that are going on. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Peanut Corporation of America, but it was a terrible thing that happened. It was located in Georgia. They had some issues, and they had their roaster wasn't working properly. It wasn't at the right temperature. They had a leaky roof. They had horrible, horrible pest control. They ended up with a positive testing of salmonella. They didn't take it seriously. They said, oh, we've always done it this way. And they kept testing until they got a negative, and then they released it. And 9 people died that they know of, and over 500 people got sick. But it's probably triple that or 10 times that, because not everybody, when you get sick, actually goes to the doctor. You get an upset stomach or a bout of diarrhea or something. It passes and you go on with life, but it's something you ate, most likely. But hopefully we have a strong immune system and it doesn't affect us. But the older people and the younger people definitely get affected. Now, I added a couple more slides here this afternoon to talk about what is food safety and why is food safety important. We have about 5 more minutes before we have questions, but I don't know, do the food processing associates understand their role in safety, and how many lives can be affected with just one mistake? One of the examples I use is with juice. Concentrated orange juice is carried from a juice manufacturer or juice squeezer or manufacturer. They load over-the-road transports, and they hold 6,000 gallons of concentrated orange juice. They send it to a dairy. The dairy blends that back up at 1 to 3. So 6,000 gallons will make 24,000 gallons. 24,000 gallons times 120 ounces per gallon divided by 8 ounces per serving is how many individual lives that one tanker could affect if something is wrong with it. And some companies that fill those tankers, they fill 40 or 50 a day. So employees need to be educated. I like to use educated because training is like Pavlov's dog. You ring the bell and they come. So we need to really educate and really need to communicate this to our folks. Do they understand what hazards are? Now, the definition of safe product from the World Health Organization is food that will not cause harm to the consumer when it is prepared and or eaten according to its intended use. That's a safe product. A hazard is a biological, chemical, or physical agent that is reasonably likely to cause injury or illness in the absence of control. So that's where we have these hazard analysis, and a company will look at their process. So for instance, they'll look at receiving. Are there any hazards, any biological that could make us sick, any chemical that could come in, any cross-contamination that could happen, can physical happen? And they do the hazard analysis and determine how they are going to control that. And then the center, CDC, they got their hands full now, of course, but you know, they estimate, and this is so underestimated, I'm sure, 48 million foodborne illnesses occur a year, 128,000 hospitalizations, at least 3,000 deaths, and a whole bunch of millions of dollars in financial losses and physical and emotional harm. As I said, you know, a gentleman who taught me everything I know about food safety years ago, John Porter, he said, every 20th meal will get you. And every 200th meal will get you, I'm sorry. And that's where, you know, we'll go out, we'll eat something. Like I said, we'll have maybe stomach cramps. We'll wake up one day maybe with a headache. We think we have the 24-hour bug. Just about everything is from something we ate. It just affects people differently, and it depends on what it is, whether it's E. coli, salmonella, listeria. But a food manufacturer is responsible for producing a safe product. You know, there's a lot of lawsuits out there pending, and there's a lot of recent issues that have happened where we might see them in jail too. But the people who were responsible for Peanut Corporation of America, they are in jail. It took several years to prosecute them, but they are in jail now for the rest of their lives. The president's there, the production manager is there, the quality manager, I think, made a deal. They first gave him 10 years for falsifying records and let him out, I think, in 5 because they turned state evidence. But it's no fun to do this, and people are responsible.
I learned a lot about the various standards, and you know that are out there, and things that you work with. Since we have so many people on the call, we have about 50 people here. Rather than have everybody try to jump in by voice, what I'd like to do is, if you could just indicate to me in the chat that you have a question. You don't have to write the whole question there, but I'll call on you by name and you can unmute and ask the question. There is one question actually already in the chat I'd like to start off with. So the question is about the regulations regarding how much antibiotics can be used, you know, in meats. How much antibiotics can be present in the meats? Is any of that covered by any of the standards, or perhaps not maybe regulations? You
cannot put any antibiotic in meat. You cannot put it in there. That's why it's so funny to see those ridiculous, I don't know if it's Tyson or Purdue, advertised chicken and said, oh, we're 100% antibiotic free. Well, they all are. You are not allowed. If you have a sick animal and you need antibiotics, then you have to keep that separate until it gets out of the system. And it's also true for milking cows. Every load of milk is tested for antibiotics when it reaches the fluid milk plant. And if it has antibiotics on it, it gets dumped in a field. It can't even go for feed. It is not allowed antibiotics. It's just not. It's a chemical contaminant, and people have allergies. And I have seen personally more than once where a load of milk had antibiotics in it. It was loaded into a 50,000 gallon silo that had several other loads of milk in there, and the whole thing had to be emptied and dumped in a field, even though the test came up negative when it got diluted.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Let's see. There's another question about shelf life. Is shelf life addressed? And how, if it is?
Well, yes. Shelf life is really up to the manufacturer, and it depends on the product, but most shelf life is all about the quality of the product. it's not that when it passes shelf life, you're going to eat it and you're going to get sick and be very sick and possibly lose your life. Shelf life is more of a quality issue where it deteriorates the product. And it will spoil. And spoilage organisms, even though when we think about it, it makes, take a swig of sour milk, you really think you're going to die, but that doesn't have pathogens. That's a spoilage organisms, and it won't, technically, it's not a pathogen.
Okay.
So shelf life is really a quality issue. If you have like something, I just had a couple protein bars here, and they're past their shelf life, and they're really stale. But I can eat them. They're not going to hurt me. It's just a quality thing about them.
So shelf life is really determined then by the food science of food, or perhaps just arbitrarily, maybe not arbitrarily, but determined by the manufacturer. Is that how that's?
Typically, they collect data, and it really just depends on the product that you have. But you have to have the data to show that your product will keep at that long and further. Like for instance, with milk, they have to prove that milk will keep 5 days past the date on the container. So if you have a gallon of milk and it's out of date, I've had milk keep a week after that date. It doesn't mean it's going to go bad magically on that date. It just means that the way they process it, they are saying that it's going to be it's going to be good until tastes good until that date. It's not going to sour.
Okay. Are the results of audits public? Are they public record? I suppose it doesn't say specifically, but I suppose they mean the FDA audits or even internal quality audits.
If FDA cites you for something, then it is on the FDA website, and you can go onto the FDA website and look at your suppliers and see if they've ever had what they call 483, and that's a finding. And they get that, and they have to answer to it. And there are some that are more serious than others where they have to stop production. And
is that public then, or is that public information?
Yes, just go to the FDA website. Now, that's an FDA. Now, other audits, really like on the food safety management system programs and standards, those really are not public. But who is approved is, you can go on their websites and see who's approved.
Okay. All right, thanks. Let's see. Another question: How much of the supply chain does this apply to? How far down, for instance, the supply chain does the certifications pertain?
Well, the programs, you've got to have a supplier management program. It's just like what ISO 9001 has. And you have to base it on, food safety and quality, critical companies, and get assurance that they're doing what they say they're doing. And it's all about risk. If it's a low risk ingredient, then obviously you don't have to worry so much. If it's a high risk, then you need to have paperwork and you need to have proof. And some companies even have one of their employees there when it's being processed. Supplier management, to me right now, is probably the weakest link in the food industry, because a lot of the little guys really can't afford to do what the big guys can do. The big guys have laboratories, they have pre-shipment samples, but if you're a little bakery on the corner and you want to order something, it's all about the money, and you could get somebody else's reject. Okay. Now, if it's rejected for food safety or adulterated, then that's against the law, but somebody has to catch them.
Okay, thanks. I had a client that was in the food processing, mostly seafood. And they used to tell me that, and this was just a couple of years ago, they told me that their clients, their customers, more and more were trending towards, really identifying the source of their product. And you can imagine in the seafood industry, they're looking at whether it's farmed or wild caught, or where the farms are, and those kinds of things. Do the regulations? Well, I'm sure the regulations probably do, but do the standards in any way address that?
Yes, they need to understand their source, and the sources, it depends on the seafood. Like with oysters, is Is it a safe source, or is it the time of year? Is it the proper time of year, and that kind of thing? Yeah, supplier management is huge for both the standards and it's a preventive control. It's one of the key items that the Food Safety Modernization Act focuses on, that companies have to evaluate. Now, there are some food companies that have what they call a SOCOTA finding, and that's a critical finding that is a high risk. And if that's the case, then they really have to have that very well under control.
Okay. Let's see. I got a question about blockchain in the food, in the food industry, food processing industry. Are you familiar with blockchain,
No.
Debbie? And is it? Well, it's really a data protection, supply chain. I'm not an expert in it either, but it has something to do with
the software program.
It's not really software, but it's a scheme for protecting data so that it can't be altered. And John, if I'm describing this wrong, you let me know. But yeah, it's for traceability. Correct. Is that the?
You're getting it, Philip. Basically, yeah, it's just a tool. Like, I know they use it a lot in oil. I'm from oil and gas, and they use it a lot in oil and gas to kind of find out, the true origin of it, and they can trace it all the way back to the supply chain. So if something does fail, they can very quickly go back and find out where it failed, and kind of stop things in place. And I've heard that they were using that in the food industry. I was just wondering, what Debbie's thoughts were and experience with it was.
I can answer your question, but I'd rather talk about those baseballs and bats behind you. Maybe later, huh, John?
Sure. That's just one side of the wall. You should. I got a whole bunch of. I'm a memorabilia junkie, so yeah.
I have a dog named Mookie Jack. He's named after Mookie Betts and Jackie Bradley Jr. And
That's funny. I have a dog named Mookie as well.
Yeah. Okay. Do you really?
Yeah, Mookie. I'll get him in here in a second. I'll call him.
Yeah. Anyways, Mookie Jack. I actually have a picture of him signed by both of them. But anyways, back to your question. There's the software. There's a lot of software. I haven't heard of that in the food industry or traceability, but we have things like TraceGains and Safety Chain, a whole bunch of different software programs. Which one's Mookie? Hey, Mook. I'll bring my Mookie in a minute. But as a matter of fact, you're probably here.
The other one's Griffey for Ken Griffey Jr.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
So okay.
So anyways, traceability with software is really a good thing. Some of it is a little bit overzealous, and it's the thing that I really urge my clients is, when you look for a software like that, try to get one where the people who work in it and the people who develop it understand the industry. Because I know in the early days of 9001, there was lots of software programs out there, but I swear none of those people had ever looked at an ISO standard, because they were crazy. So that's how it is. So, okay, sorry.
That's all right, thanks. So here's an interesting question about organics, organic products, and organic, companies that make organic products. They're held to the same standards, I assume, as if they're food processing as anyone else. Does the organics fit
Organic is on top of what's required by the regulations and by the standards. Organic is on top of that. So a company has to meet the regulatory requirements. They have to meet this. If they're going to be certified to a food safety standard, they have to meet those. And then if they want to be organic certified, they hire an organic company to do it.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Debbie. I'm sorry, there's a couple more questions here, but we're running out of time, getting close to the end here. So I just wanted to tell everyone again, as noted earlier, that the recording of the webinar will be uploaded to the ASQ 1510 YouTube channel, probably by tomorrow. And the slides will be available on the LinkedIn group, the ASQ Southeast Florida Section 1510 LinkedIn group. You'll be able to pull those up. You'll be getting an email over the course of the next few days, as proof for our use for recertification purposes. So you'll be getting that. If you don't see that, within a week or 10 days, just let me know. And for some reason we'll figure it out and we'll get that to you later. There is a survey we would like to ask you to complete before you, or as you sign out of here, or just before you sign out. I've posted the link on the in the chat, so you can do that. Or if you want to scan the QR code, I've also got that here. I'm putting up on the screen right now. You should see that if you either way. But if you could please, do the survey, we really do appreciate it, and we really do seek your feedback on this. I want to thank Debbie very much for joining us tonight and talking to us about the food processing and compliance in that area. It was really interesting, Debbie, and I know I learned a lot. And I saw a couple of comments already in the chat that others also enjoyed it, and we'll have more feedback from the survey, and I'll pass that along to you as well in the near future. I thank everyone for being on the call today. And that's about it. Debbie, any closing comment?
Yes, I'd like to thank you. I hope I didn't ramble too much, but I wanted to ask if you guys have a question or if you need anything, please, my email is on the last slide. So please feel free to drop me a note, and I'll answer it or send you some information or whatever, because this really was very enjoyable. Thank you.
Okay.
And Duke, we got to catch up. It's been too long.
Okay, well, thank you. I want to, again, thank you to everyone. If there's nothing else,
Hey, Phil?
Robert, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, question. What's happening with certifications?
I can't answer that. I don't know that, but I'll get you some information about that.
Yeah, I didn't know if ASQ was giving extra time for certifications or not, or.
As far as I know, no. Anybody else from the board have that information?
I spoke, Philip, this is John Bloxham again. I spoke with ASQ this morning, and because one of my certifications